Hello everyone and welcome to my TED Talk. I would like to take you through a journey. This is my journey in discovering more about culturally responsive teaching, and my journey began with an inquiry. And that inquiry question was, how can mathematics be used to teach cultural responsiveness? So I wanted to learn more about how math class, which is a subject typically known for being very rigid, numerical, and so absolute, how it could involve and teach cultural responsiveness. So that is what led me to this question. And at this point, my journey had just begun, but before I went out and searched for any concrete examples of culturally responsive teaching, I first wanted to learn more about what culturally responsive teaching actually is. So, what is culturally responsive teaching? Well, it is a pedagogy that uses students' customs, characteristics, experiences, and perspectives as tools for better classroom instruction. This teaches students to understand cultural differences, recognize potential biases, and look beyond their own cultural contexts. So I also wanted to learn more about what isn't culturally responsive teaching and some common misconceptions or mistakes that teachers make. So the first one is that culturally responsive teaching is not the same as multicultural or social justice education. So this is actually false. And culturally responsive teaching is actually more about building the learning capacity of each individual student. The second misconception is that teachers must address implicit bias in their teaching. So rather than focusing directly on implicit bias, teachers should focus on understanding inequities by design of their lessons. And you can talk about implicit bias in instruction and come back to microaggressions, but really the sequencing of that is really important. The third thing on there, teachers must build relationships and self-esteem. This is actually false as well. And relationships are important, but building relationships does not necessarily increase a student's ability to do more challenging academic work. And the last thing on the list, the last misconception is culturally responsive teaching is about choosing the right strategies. This is false as well, and culturally responsive teaching is not just a plug and play strategies into your lessons and then you're good to go. No, it's not an off-the-shelf program. It's not 2 or 3 strategies. Rather, you should focus on teaching good for all brains and for all students. So a good way to judge whether your teaching is culturally responsive is if your diverse students, so your students of color, your English language learners, your immigrant students, if they're learning. What you do to reach your lowest achieving students will also be good for your highest achieving students as well. Of course, it's all well and good to know what culturally responsive teaching looks like, but why is it important? What are students getting out of this teaching practice? Well, culturally responsive teaching helps students to develop their cultural competence and critical consciousness, and it also furthers students' intellectual abilities, problem-solving abilities, and appreciations of other cultures. So a quote here from Dr. Jim Ewing as well says that if educators are not culturally responsive, some students may develop the belief that math is for others and not for them. And this kind of reaches the heart of what culturally responsive teaching is. You want your students to feel that they are seen in what they are learning. So now that we understand more about what culturally responsive teaching is, what it looks like, what it doesn't look like as well, and why it's important, we can now begin to ask ourselves, well, what might a culturally responsive math lesson look like? So let's bring in the mathematics context now and see how we can create these culturally responsive math lessons. So here are some ways to incorporate culturally responsive teaching that all educators should keep in mind. So you can include experiences of the community, real-world math scenarios that connect students' language and background. You can present math problems in various languages and cultural contexts. You can include math experiences that connect. So these are things like working together in pairs, get to know you activities, embedding local community into the instruction, focusing on students' traditions of oral language and dance, including elements of local and native language, and lastly, using culturally responsive manipulatives are all good ways to make sure your practice includes cultural responsiveness. Again, these are not just like plug and play strategies that you can do off the shelf. It's really a belief in all of these and embedded in your practice. So here's just one example of a culturally responsive math lesson. In this, it involves students bringing in the instructions for their favorite recipe, which is fantastic because the teacher is connecting students' language and their background to what they're learning. You may have also recently heard about culturally responsive education in the news. This includes everything from specific plans, like the Anti-Racism Action Plan for More Inclusive Schools in BC that you can find here, and also plans regarding inclusiveness and the difficulties that teachers are facing as well. So now you know how to create culturally responsive lessons. You've also learned how a course like math can still be culturally responsive. Whenever it comes time for you to be a teacher, remember the importance of culturally responsive teaching. We are all teachers in some way, and I hope you've taken something away from this TED Talk. Thank you.